Wazon gasped in horror as his serrated claw ripped into Greg's human flesh like it was paper, spewing crimson blood before his bulbous eyes. Greg was on Zosma Prime, representing Earth at the Galactic University, but his deadly homeworld was a mystery to the diverse alien student body. Wazon expected Greg to collapse, quivering in agony from the deep gash, but the young human simply pressed his palm to the wound, blood leaking between his bony fingers as he stayed standing. Wazon's scaly mouth gaped in shock at the human's unnatural durability. "Here's just a scratch," Greg said flatly, glancing down at his slick red forearm. "No worries." Multicolored blobs representing dozens of alien races gathered around, murmuring in amazement at the uncanny spectacle. A lanky grey humanoid extended Greg a silky bandage, but he waved it away. Wazon towered over Greg, reptilian eyes studying the fascinating creature. "I've never met a human before. Let me walk you to the campus medical center to get that wound sealed. I'm curious to learn about your species and planet." "Sure, I could use a guide around here," Greg replied. During their walk, Wazon probed Greg with questions about Earth. Greg chuckled. "Well, for starters, Earth is classified as a Deathworld. The environment there is extremely dangerous and hostile to life. Hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, poisonous creatures, deadly diseases, you name it. My species evolved to survive constant threats to our existence." Wazon shuddered at the hellish description, scarcely able to imagine such a nightmarish realm. What kind of monster could emerge from an apocalyptic landscape like Earth? Wazon found himself both captivated and unnerved by this mysterious human. He sensed Greg was hiding the true extent of humanity's power. As the unlikely pair entered the medical center, Wazon knew he needed to uncover the secrets of the human homeworld, sensing that the fate of the galaxy itself could depend on it. Humanity's success integrating into galactic society hinged on Wazon stopping them from conquering the whole universe. Wazon wouldn't let the ruthless Deathworlders seize control without a fight to the death. As the days turned to weeks, Greg noticed a growing unease among his alien classmates. Whereas before they had been eager to learn about Earth and its peculiarities, now their curiosity was tinged with apprehension. Wazon, who had initially been so friendly, began to distance himself, his reptilian eyes often darting nervously in Greg's direction during shared classes. The shift in atmosphere came to a head during a xenobiology lecture by Professor Zaxxon. The Nausicaan academic, known for his extensive research on interspecies dynamics, broached the topic of apex predators and their role in shaping ecosystems. "Consider the human," Zaxxon said, his gravelly voice echoing through the lecture hall. "Evolved on a death world, they have developed a unique combination of intelligence, adaptability, and capacity for violence that has allowed them to thrive in the harshest of conditions." As the professor spoke, Greg felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him. Some were merely curious, but others held a glimmer of fear, as if they were reassessing the potential threat posed by the lone human in their midst. "But Professor," a Nausicaan student interjected, "doesn't that make humans dangerous? If they're so well adapted to violence, what's to stop them from turning on the rest of the galaxy?" The lecture hall erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and whispers, with students arguing back and forth about the implications of humanity's evolutionary history. Greg sat in silence, his heart sinking as he realized that his mere presence was causing a rift among his peers. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Rumors began to circulate about the potential danger posed by humans, with some students even suggesting that Greg's admission to the university had been a mistake. The once welcoming campus began to feel increasingly hostile, with suspicious glances and hushed conversations following Greg wherever he went. One evening, as Greg made his way back to his dormitory, he found his path blocked by a group of Nausicaan students. At their head was Kazak, a notorious rival of Wazon's, known for his aggressive demeanor. "You don't belong here, human," Kazak snarled, his razor-sharp teeth glinting in the fading light. "Your kind brings nothing but trouble. Leave now, before someone gets hurt." Greg stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated by the display of aggression. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Kazakh and his followers advanced, hissing and baring their claws in an attempt to cow the human into submission. But Greg remained unflinching, his eyes locked with Kazakh's in a silent battle of wills. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. Campus security, alerted by the commotion, arrived on the scene, dispersing the crowd and escorting Greg safely back to his room. But as he lay in his bed that night, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The incident with Kazakh had made it clear that not everyone at the university was willing to accept him, and he wondered if he would ever truly find a place among the stars. News of Greg's confrontation with Kazakh spread like wildfire through the university's alien grapevine. Hushed whispers echoed in the halls, and suspicious glances followed Greg everywhere. Soon a message flashed on Greg's holopad. He was summoned to a meeting with the university administration. Heart-pounding, he made his way to the imposing obsidian tower at the center of campus. Inside a sterile white office, Greg found himself face-to-face with Dean Zorel, a towering insectoid being with glittering compound eyes and a perpetual air of disapproval. Zorel clicked his mandibles as he studied a holographic report hovering above his desk. "Human Greg," Zorel intoned, his telepathic voice reverberating inside Greg's skull. "Your presence here has caused significant disruption among the student body. Many fear your species' capacity for violence. Perhaps it would be best if you transferred to a less prestigious institution. For your own safety, of course." Greg's hands balled into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "With all due respect, Dean Zorel, I have every right to pursue my education here. I won't be intimidated into leaving." Zorel's multifaceted eyes shimmered, his thoughts unreadable. After a long moment he waved a spindly appendage. "Very well, you may stay, but know that you will be under close scrutiny. Any further incidents will result in immediate expulsion. Is that clear?" Greg nodded curtly. Understood. Determined to prove himself, Greg threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor. He spent long hours in the library, poring over ancient tomes on xenobiology and galactic history. In class, he participated eagerly, his unique human perspective adding depth to the discussions. To Greg's surprise, he found an unlikely ally in Professor Zaxxon. The grizzled Nausicaan took a keen interest in Greg's background, often calling on him to share insights from his homeworld. Under Zaxxon's guidance, Greg's classmates slowly began to see him as more than just a dangerous curiosity. But as the semester wore on, strange occurrences began to plague the campus. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation, plunging classrooms into darkness. Minor accidents became increasingly common, leaving students on edge. At first, Greg dismissed the incidents as mere coincidence, but as the pattern continued, a nagging suspicion took root in his mind. Was someone targeting him, trying to drive him away? Late one night, Greg found himself alone in the university's cavernous xenobiology lab, hunched over a microscope. The room was silent save for the hum of machinery and the occasional skitter of specimens in their containment units. Suddenly, a soft clanking sound echoed from the far corner of the lab. Greg's head snapped up, his senses on high alert. Slowly he crept towards the source of the noise, his heart racing. There in the shadows a figure stood hunched over a containment unit, long fingers manipulating the locking mechanism. Greg squinted, trying to make out the intruder's features, but the darkness shrouded them like a cloak. Just as Greg opened his mouth to confront the trespasser, a sickening crunch filled the air. The containment unit burst open, and a seething mass of insectoid creatures poured out, their iridescent carapaces glinting in the dim light. Greg stumbled back, eyes wide with horror. The creatures swarmed towards him, their barbed stingers dripping with venom. He spun towards the door, but it was too late. The deadly swarm had already cut off his escape, filling the air with their angry buzzing. Greg's heart pounded as the venomous insectoids swarmed around him, their barbed stingers glinting menacingly. Acting on pure adrenaline-fueled instinct, He lunged for the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Yanking it free, he aimed the nozzle at the advancing swarm and squeezed the trigger. A jet of freezing white foam sprayed out, forming a temporary barrier between Greg and the deadly creatures. Gripping the fire extinguisher tightly, Greg began to fight his way through the swarm. He used short bursts of foam to clear a path, while relying on his quick human reflexes to dodge the venomous stingers that lunged at him from all sides. The insectoids buzzed angrily as he pushed forward, their iridescent carapaces glinting in the flickering light. Just as Greg neared the airlock, a desperate cry pierced through the drone of the swarm. He turned to see Wezen, his Nausicaan classmate, cornered on the other side of the lab. The insectoids had surrounded Wezen, their stingers jabbing at his scaly hide. Wezen's natural defenses, so effective against other threats, were useless against the sheer number of attackers. Greg hesitated for only a moment. He had come so close to escape, but he couldn't leave Wezen to face the swarm alone. Without a second thought, he leaped back into the fray, wielding the fire extinguisher like a battle axe. Foam flew in all directions as Greg fought his way to Wezen's side, the insectoids hissing and recoiling from the icy spray. Together, the human and Nausicaan made a final push towards the airlock. Greg felt Wezen's claws on his back, pushing him forward as he cleared a path through the swarm. At last, they stumbled into the airlock, slamming the door shut behind them just as the insectoids closed in. As the airlock cycled, Greg and Wezen collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. Wezen turned to Greg, his reptilian eyes wide with shock and newfound respect. "Josh, you saved me," Wezen rasped, his voice raw from the exertion. "I thought you would leave me behind." Before Wezen could respond, an ear-splitting alarm blared through the university, accompanied by the crackle of the emergency broadcast system. Dean Zorel's telepathic voice echoed in their minds, his tone grave and urgent. "Attention all students and faculty. The university is under attack by a group of extremists who believe that humans and other Deathworld species pose a threat to galactic order. The incident in the xenobiology lab was not an isolated event, but part of a coordinated assault. Please remain calm and follow emergency protocols until further notice." As the message faded, Greg and Wezen exchanged a look of grim understanding. The attack on the lab had been no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to target Greg and drive him from the university. And now, with the entire campus in chaos, they found themselves at the epicenter of a growing crisis that threatened to tear the fragile fabric of interspecies relations apart. As the university went into lockdown, armed security personnel swarmed the campus, their heavy boots pounding against the polished floors. Greg and Wezen found themselves sequestered in a stark interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on their faces as they recounted the harrowing events in the xenobiology lab. "You acted with incredible bravery," the lead investigator, a grizzled Nausicaan with a jagged scar running down his cheek, said to Greg. "Your quick thinking saved not only your own life, but that of your classmate as well." Greg nodded solemnly, the weight of the ordeal still heavy on his shoulders. As the questioning continued, it became increasingly clear that the attack was not an isolated incident. The extremists, it seemed, were part of a larger network, hell-bent on purging the galaxy of those they deemed unworthy. Professor Zaxxon, visibly shaken by the recent events, revealed that he had been the target of threats from the group. "They warned me to stop my research," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "They said that if I continued to study the adaptations of species from Deathworlds, there would be consequences." As the investigation wore on, Greg and Wezen found themselves under constant surveillance. Armed guards shadowed their every move, their presence a stark reminder of the looming threat. Despite the added security, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen enemies, their malevolent gaze piercing through the very walls of the university. Late one night, as Greg sat hunched over Professor Zaxxon's research notes, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He looked up, his heart pounding, but saw only the play of shadows cast by the dim desk lamp. With a shuddering breath, he turned his attention back to the notes, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. And there it was, buried deep within the professor's meticulous records. A reference to a mysterious signal emanating from an uncharted region of space. The signal, according to ancient legends, was believed to be the key to unlocking a powerful alien artifact, one capable of reshaping reality itself. As Greg delved deeper into the professor's findings, a chilling realization dawned on him. The extremists, it seemed, were not content with merely driving out those they saw as a threat. They sought something far more sinister, the power to bend the very fabric of the universe to their will. With trembling hands, Greg reached for his communicator, knowing that he had to warn the authorities before it was too late. But as his fingers brushed against the device, a sudden flicker of movement in the shadows caught his eye once more. This time, however, the figure that emerged was no trick of the light. "Well, well," a cold voice hissed from the darkness. "What do we have here?" Greg's blood ran cold as he recognized the speaker, Kazak, the Nausicaan who had confronted him in the hallway just days before. But now the alien's eyes gleamed with a malevolent intensity, his razor-sharp claws flexing menacingly at his sides. "You should have left when you had the chance, human," Kazak snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Now you've stuck your nose where it doesn't belong, and you're going to pay the price." As Kazak lunged forward, his claws outstretched, Greg knew that he was in for the fight of his life. With a surge of adrenaline, he leapt to his feet, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fate of the galaxy, he realized, might very well rest in his hands. Greg's mind raced as he paced the confines of his dormitory room, the weight of the revelation about the extremists' plot bearing down on him like a physical force. He knew he had to act, but the thought of facing the extremists head-on sent a shiver down his spine. It was then that a knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. Weezon stood in the hallway, his reptilian eyes gleaming with a mix of determination and apprehension. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and urgent. Greg ushered him inside, and the two sat on the edge of the bed, their voices hushed as they discussed their options. "We can't just sit back and let this happen," Greg said, his hands clenched into fists. "We have to do something." Weezon nodded, his scales rippling with tension. "I might have a way in," he said slowly. "I know someone who has connections to the extremists. If we can convince them that we're interested in joining their cause, we might be able to gather more information." "It's a risk we'll have to take," Weezon replied grimly. "If we don't act now, who knows what kind of damage they could do." The two spent the next few hours hashing out the details of their plan, their voices low and urgent, as they worked to anticipate every possible outcome. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to peek through the windows, they shook hands, their faces set with grim determination. 2 days later, Greg and Weezon found themselves standing outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, their hearts pounding in their chests as they waited for their contact to arrive. When a hooded figure finally emerged from the shadows, they exchanged a tense glance before following them inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, Greg and Weezon found themselves surrounded by a group of heavily armed Nausicans, their faces twisted with suspicion and hostility. Kazak stepped into the light, his eyes glinting with malice as he regarded the two infiltrators. "I knew you'd come crawling back," he sneered. "Humans always think they're so clever, but in the end, they're just as weak as everyone else." Greg's jaw clenched at the insult, but he forced himself to remain calm. "We're not here to fight," he said evenly. "We want to join your cause." Kazak let out a harsh bark of laughter. "And why should we trust you? For all we know, you could be spies sent by the university." It was then that Weezon stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. "I vouch for him," he said, his eyes locked with Kazak's. "He's proven himself to be a true ally to our kind." For a moment the warehouse was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally Kazak nodded, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Very well," he said, "but know this, if either of you betray us, you'll wish you had never been born." With that, he led them deeper into the warehouse, past rows of crates and stacked equipment, As they walked, Greg and Wezen exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. Finally, they reached a small room at the back of the warehouse, where a group of extremists were gathered around a large table. On the table sat a small, glowing object, its surface pulsing with an eerie blue light. Greg's eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. It was a fragment of the alien artifact, the very thing Professor Zaxxon had been researching, and from the looks of it, the extremists had already begun to harness its power. As Kazak began to outline their plan, a devastating attack on the Galactic University during the upcoming Unity Festival, Greg and Wezen exchanged a look of horror. They knew they had to act fast if they were going to stop the extremists before it was too late. But as they turned to leave, they found their path blocked by Kazak, his eyes glinting with suspicion. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Greg's heart raced as he realized they had been caught. He glanced at Wezen, hoping for some sign of what to do next, but the Nausicaan looked just as panicked as he felt. "We were just—" Greg started, but Kazak cut him off with a snarl. "I know what you were doing," he hissed. "You're not here to join us at all, are you? You're spies sent to infiltrate our ranks and stop us from achieving our goals." Kazak took a step forward, his claws flexing menacingly at his sides. "Well, let me tell you something, human. You may have fooled the others, but you can't fool me. I've seen your kind before, with your soft skin and your weak hearts. You don't have what it takes to stand with us." Greg's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of the situation. He knew that if Kazak exposed them, they'd be dead before they could even blink. But if they tried to fight their way out, they'd be hopelessly outnumbered. It was then that Wezen spoke up, his voice low and urgent. "Kazak, listen to me," he said, his eyes locked with the other Nausicaans. "We're not here to stop you. We're here because we believe in your cause. We want to see the humans put in their place just as much as you do." For a moment Kazak hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied Wezen's face. "And why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Kazak's gaze flickered between Wezen and Greg, his claws tapping against his thigh as he weighed his options. Finally he let out a low growl and stepped back. "Fine," he spat, "but if I find out you're lying to me, you'll both be dead before you can even scream." Greg and Wezen exchanged a look of relief as Kazak turned and stalked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the warehouse. But even as they made their way back out into the cool night air, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge. They had managed to escape this time, but they both knew that the real battle was still to come, and as they raced back to the university to report their findings, they couldn't help but wonder if they would be able to stop the extremists before it was too late. As the Unity Festival approached, the university was a hive of activity. Security forces patrolled the grounds around the clock, their weapons at the ready as they scanned the crowds for any sign of trouble. Greg and Wezen, now trusted members of the security team, worked tirelessly to coordinate the efforts, their eyes constantly searching for any hint of the extremists' presence. But even as they worked to keep the university safe, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step behind. Every lead they chased down seemed to dead end. Every suspicious character they questioned turned out to be a false alarm. As the festival drew nearer, the tension on campus grew thicker by the day. Students and faculty alike walked the halls with a sense of unease, their eyes darting nervously at every unexpected sound or sudden movement. And through it all, Greg and Wezen knew that somewhere out there the extremists were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had seen the power of the alien artifact firsthand, and they knew that if the extremists managed to harness its full potential, the consequences would be catastrophic. But even as they worked themselves to the bone trying to stop the impending attack, they couldn't help but feel like they were fighting a losing battle. The extremists always seemed to be one step ahead, their plans always just out of reach. And as the festival finally arrived, Greg and Wezen found themselves standing on the stage, their eyes scanning the crowds for any sign of trouble. They had done everything they could to prepare, but they both knew that in the end, it might not be enough. As the first speaker took the stage, Greg felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows, the true mastermind behind the extremists' plot was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as the crowd erupted into applause, Greg and Weazen exchanged a look of grim determination. They had come too far to back down now. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, no matter the cost. As the Unity Festival drew near, an uneasy tension hung over the university campus. Greg and Weazen, their nerves frayed from the constant vigilance, found themselves startled by the sudden chime of their comm devices. An anonymous message blinked on the screen, promising vital information about the extremists' plans. The sender instructed them to meet in a secluded corner of the campus gardens, far from the watchful eyes of the increased security presence. Greg and Weazen exchanged a wary glance, the weight of their responsibility heavy on their shoulders. They knew the risks of walking into a potential trap, but the chance to gain a crucial advantage in the fight against the extremists was too tempting to pass up. With a nod of agreement, they set off into the night, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The campus gardens were a labyrinth of twisting paths and overgrown foliage, the once carefully manicured hedges now wild and untamed. The two made their way deeper into the heart of the gardens, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As they approached the designated meeting spot, a sense of unease settled over them, the shadows seeming to close in from all sides. Suddenly a blinding light erupted from the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the gnarled trees. Greg and Weazen found themselves surrounded by a group of heavily armed extremists, their weapons trained on the pair with unwavering precision. And there, at the center of the group, stood Professor Zaxxon, his face twisted into a cruel smile as he held a pulsing fragment of the alien artifact in his clawed hand. "Ah, my dear students," Zaxxon purred, his voice dripping with malice. "I must admit I underestimated your tenacity, but in the end, you've played right into our hands." Greg and Weazen stood frozen, their minds racing as they tried to make sense of the betrayal before them. Zaxxon, the professor who had once seemed an ally, had been secretly leading the extremists all along, using his position at the university to further their insidious agenda. "You see," Zaxxon continued, his eyes gleaming with a fanatic light, "I have suffered the prejudice and discrimination of this so-called galactic community for far too long. My species, once proud and strong, has been relegated to the fringes of society, treated as little more than savages and brutes, but no more." He held the artifact fragment aloft, its otherworldly energy casting a sickly glow across his features. "With this power, I will create a new order, one in which the Deathworld species like humans will be subjugated and controlled, their strength and resilience harnessed for the greater good of the true galactic masters." As Zaxxon began to activate the artifact, the air around them crackled with energy, the very fabric of reality starting to warp and twist. Greg and Weazen, knowing they had only moments to act, launched themselves at the extremists, their training and instincts taking over as they fought to reach the mad professor. The battle was fierce and chaotic, the sound of clashing weapons and snarls of pain filling the once peaceful gardens. Greg and Weazen fought with a desperate fury, their movements a blur as they dodged and struck with all the skill they could muster. In the midst of the fray, Greg saw his chance. With a final, desperate lunge, he managed to wrest the artifact fragment from Zaxxon's grasp, the alien metal searing his flesh as he closed his hand around it. The artifact, now damaged and unstable, began to pulse with a sickening energy, the air around it shimmering like a heat haze. Greg, his mind racing, knew what he had to do. Channeling every ounce of his strength and willpower, he pulled the artifact towards himself, feeling the alien energy begin to surge through his veins. His unique human physiology, forged in the crucible of Earth's harsh environment, allowed him to absorb and contain the destructive power, even as it tore at his very being. With a final agonized cry, Greg collapsed to the ground, the artifact's energy now trapped within his unconscious form. Weazen, seeing his friend fall, let out a roar of rage and redoubled his efforts, standing over Greg's prone body as the extremists closed in. their faces twisted with hate and determination. Just as all seemed lost, the sound of thundering footsteps and shouted commands filled the air. A task force of university security and local law enforcement, alerted by the energy surge and guided by the tracking devices in Greg and Wezen's comms, burst into the gardens, their weapons at the ready. In the chaos that followed, the extremists were quickly overwhelmed and apprehended, their weapons clattering to the ground as they were forced to their knees. Professor Zaxxon, his face a mask of rage and despair, was taken into custody, his dreams of galactic domination shattered in the face of his ultimate defeat. As the dust settled, Wezen cradled Greg's unconscious form, his scales slick with the blood of their enemies. The human's fate was uncertain, the effects of the alien energy on his body a mystery even to the most advanced medical minds. With a heavy heart, Wezen watched as his friend was loaded onto a stretcher and rushed towards the university's medical center, the sirens of the emergency vehicles piercing the night air. The battle was won, but the true extent of the cost was yet to be seen. As Greg lay motionless in the hospital bed, the steady beep of the monitors echoing through the sterile room, the university community rallied around him. The doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize his condition, but the alien energy coursing through his body defied their every effort. Wezen, his scales still bearing the scars of the battle against the extremists, remained at Greg's side, his clawed hand resting gently on his friend's arm. The Nausicaa's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he whispered words of encouragement, hoping that somehow, someway Greg would find his way back to them. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that had once burned brightly began to flicker and fade. The medical team, despite their vast knowledge and cutting-edge technology, found themselves at a loss. The alien energy, so foreign and unpredictable, seemed to resist their every attempt to purge it from Greg's system. As the situation grew increasingly dire, whispers of despair began to echo through the university's halls. Students and faculty alike spoke of the human who had sacrificed everything to save them, and the fear that he might never wake up. Just when all seemed lost, a figure emerged from the shadows of the medical center's entrance. Dr. Elena Roth, a human xenobiologist renowned for her work on alien artifacts, strode into the hospital with a determined gleam in her eye. She had been following the events at the university from afar, and something about Greg's case had caught her attention. Dr. Roth wasted no time in joining the medical team, her keen intellect and unorthodox methods bringing a new energy to the fight for Greg's life. She believed that Greg's unique adaptation to the alien energy held the key to unlocking new frontiers in interspecies communication and cooperation. Together, Dr. Roth and the medical team worked around the clock, poring over data and testing new theories. They developed a radical treatment plan, one that would harness the very energy that threatened to consume Greg and use it to establish a connection with his unconscious mind. As the treatment began, the monitors suddenly came alive with activity. Greg's vital signs, once weak and erratic, began to stabilize. The energy readings fluctuated wildly, then settled into a steady rhythm. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. The entire university held its breath as Greg's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused and distant. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. But the words that spilled from his lips were unlike anything anyone had ever heard before, a language that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the universe itself. Dr. Roth leaned in closer, her eyes wide with wonder and amazement. She realized that Greg was communicating on a level that transcended mere language. He was tapping into the fundamental building blocks of reality itself. It became clear that the alien energy had not only saved Greg's life, but had also granted him an incredible gift: the ability to bridge the gap between species, to communicate with life forms across the galaxy in a way that had never been possible before. As Greg spoke, his words seemed to weave a tapestry of understanding, his message one of hope and unity in the face of adversity. The road ahead would not be easy, but with Greg's newfound abilities and the support of his friends and allies, anything seemed possible. The university had been forever changed by the events of the past few months, but now there was a chance for a new beginning, a chance to build a future where all species could live and work together in harmony. As Weizhen looked down at his friend, a smile spreading across his reptilian face, he knew that the fight was far from over. But for the first time, he allowed himself to hope, to believe that together they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Greg's eyes locked with Weizhen's, a flicker of recognition sparking within their depths. He reached out, his hand trembling with the effort, and grasped his friend's clawed fingers. In that moment, a connection was forged, a bond that transcended species and defied the very laws of the universe itself. And as the alien energy pulsed within Greg's body, a beacon of hope in a galaxy torn by conflict and strife, the true power of unity and understanding began to take shape. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the universe would never be the same again. As Greg slowly regained consciousness in the hospital bed, his mind swam with a barrage of disjointed images and sensations. The alien energy coursed through his veins, pulsing in time with his heartbeat as it suffused every cell of his being. He could feel it, a raw and primal power that both terrified and exhilarated him. Weizhen sat at his bedside, his reptilian eyes fixed on Greg's face. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Greg struggled to find the words to describe the strange new reality he found himself in. "Different," he managed, his voice hoarse from disuse, "like I'm not quite myself anymore." As the days passed and Greg grew stronger, news of his miraculous recovery and newfound abilities began to spread throughout the galactic community. Some hailed him as a savior, a bridge between worlds that could usher in a new era of peace and understanding. They saw in him the potential for a brighter future, one in which the barriers between species could be broken down and all could live in harmony. But others viewed Greg with suspicion and fear, seeing him as a threat to the delicate balance of power that had governed the galaxy for centuries. They whispered of the dangers of allowing a human, a being from a Deathworld, to wield such immense power. Some even called for Greg to be locked away, studied, or even eliminated, lest he bring chaos and destruction to the fragile peace that had been so hard won. As the debate raged on, Greg found himself struggling to come to terms with his new reality. The power within him was unlike anything he had ever experienced, and he could feel it growing stronger with each passing day. It was as if a part of the artifact had become fused with his very soul, granting him abilities that defied explanation. But with that power came a terrible burden, as Greg began to experience vivid dreams and visions of a looming darkness that threatened to consume everything in its path. He saw flashes of an ancient evil, a malevolent entity that had been sealed away by the creators of the artifact, its power too great to be allowed to roam free. In his dreams, Greg could feel the entity straining against its bonds, drawn to the power that now resided within him. He knew that it was only a matter of time before it broke free, and that when it did, the galaxy would be plunged into an age of darkness and despair. Desperate to find a way to stop the coming apocalypse, Greg pored over the research notes left behind by Professor Zaxxon and the other xenobiologists who had studied the artifact. He learned that the artifact was not a tool of creation, as he had once believed, but a weapon of last resort, designed to contain the entity and prevent it from consuming all life in the galaxy. As the visions grew more intense and the sense of impending doom more palpable, Greg made a fateful decision. Using his newfound abilities, he reached out across the vast distances of space, sending a message to the leaders of the galactic community. In it, he warned them of the danger that loomed on the horizon and urged them to put aside their differences and unite against the common threat. At first his warnings fell on deaf ears, dismissed as the ravings of a madman or the delusions of a power-hungry despot. But as reports of strange phenomena and inexplicable events began to pour in from across the galaxy, more and more began to take notice. Weizhen, who had remained by Greg's side throughout his recovery, watched as his friend grew more and more consumed by the visions that haunted him. He could see the toll it was taking on Greg's mind and body, and he knew that time was running out. "We have to do something," Greg said, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "We can't just sit back and watch as the galaxy falls into darkness." Weezon nodded, his own resolve hardening. "What do you need me to do?" Together, they began to plan their next move, poring over star charts and ancient texts as they searched for clues to the location of the artifact's creators. They knew that they were the only ones who could stop the entity from breaking free, and that the fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders. As they prepared to embark on their perilous journey, Greg could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon him. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, and that there was no guarantee of success. But he also knew that he had no choice. The power within him was a responsibility, a burden that he could not ignore. And though the thought of what lay ahead filled him with a sense of dread, he knew that he would face it head-on, no matter the cost. With a final nod to Weezon, Greg stepped out into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future of the galaxy hung in the balance, and he would not rest until the darkness was banished once and for all. As they journeyed deeper into the uncharted reaches of space, following the faint trail of clues left behind by the artifact's creators, Greg could feel the darkness growing ever closer. It was as if the entity could sense his approach, and was gathering its strength for the final confrontation. In his dreams he could see it more clearly now, a seething mass of shadow and malice, a being of pure entropy that sought only to consume and destroy. It whispered to him in the depths of his mind, taunting him with visions of a galaxy in ruins, of worlds consumed by fire and death. But Greg refused to give in to despair. He clung to the hope that had brought him this far, the belief that even in the darkest of times there was always a chance for redemption. And as he and Weezon pressed on, following the faint glimmer of light that seemed to beckon them forward, he could feel that hope growing stronger within him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of searching, they found what they had been seeking, a hidden outpost, long abandoned by its creators, that held the key to stopping the entity once and for all. Within its crumbling walls, they discovered ancient texts and artifacts that spoke of a ritual, a way to seal the entity away, using the power of the artifact that had brought them this far. But as they delved deeper into the secrets of the outpost, they realized that the ritual came with a terrible price. In order to seal the entity away, the wielder of the artifact would have to sacrifice their own life force, using it to power the ancient magic that would bind the creature back into its prison. Greg felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he had to do. He knew that he was the only one who could wield the artifact, the only one with the strength and the will to see the ritual through to the end. But Greg shook his head, a sad smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "There isn't," he said softly. "This is the only way to stop the entity, to save the galaxy from the darkness that threatens to consume it." Weezon nodded, tears welling up in his reptilian eyes. "I promise," he said, his voice choked with emotion. With a final nod, Greg turned to face the entity, the artifact clutched tightly in his hand. He could feel its power surging through him, filling him with a strength and a clarity of purpose that he had never known before. As the entity emerged from the shadows, its form twisting and writhing in the darkness, Greg unleashed the full might of the artifact. Blinding light filled the chamber as he channeled the energy of the ancient device, pouring every ounce of his strength and his will into the final desperate battle. The entity screamed in rage and agony as it was enveloped by the searing light, its form dissolving and reforming as it fought against the power of the artifact. But Greg held firm, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination as he pushed himself to the very limits of his endurance. And then, with a final ear-splitting shriek, the entity was gone, sealed away once more in the depths of the void. Greg felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him as he collapsed to the ground, his life force spent in the effort to bind the creature back into its prison. Weezon rushed to his side, cradling Greg's head in his lap as he searched desperately for any sign of life. But it was too late. Greg's eyes stared sightlessly up at the ceiling, his body still and lifeless in Weezon's arms. Tears streamed down Weezon's face as he held his friend close. the weight of the galaxy's loss pressing down upon him like a physical force. He knew that Greg had given his life to save them all, that his sacrifice had ensured that the darkness would never again threaten the fragile peace of the galactic community. As word of Greg's heroic act spread throughout the stars, the galaxy mourned the loss of its savior, but even in death his legacy lived on, a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity and the power of unity in the face of darkness. The Galactic University, once a bastion of mistrust and prejudice, underwent a profound transformation in the wake of Greg's sacrifice. A new department was established in his honor, dedicated to the study of Deathworld species and the promotion of interspecies understanding. Scholars from across the galaxy flocked to its halls, eager to learn from the example set by the human who had given his life for the greater good. And though the galaxy would never be the same, it was forever changed by the courage and compassion of one remarkable individual. Greg's story would be told and retold for generations to come, a shining beacon of hope in a universe that had once seemed so cold and unforgiving. As Wazen stood before the memorial erected in Greg's honor, he felt a sense of pride and purpose well up within him. He knew that he would spend the rest of his days fighting to uphold the ideals that Greg had embodied, working tirelessly to build a future in which all species could live together in peace and harmony. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, Wazen knew that he would never waver in his commitment to that noble goal, for he had made a promise to his friend, a promise that he intended to keep until his dying breath. The galaxy had been forever changed by the sacrifice of one human who had dared to bridge the divide between worlds. And in that change, there was hope for a brighter tomorrow, a future in which the light of unity and understanding would shine forevermore. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.